The 10 lost tribes of Israel, where are they now? Genesis 10:21, quote, "Unto Shem also, the father of all the children of Eber, the brother of Japheth the elder, even to him were children born." End quote. Genesis 10:3-7 tells us which sons of Noah, the Gentile nations came from, being Ham and Japheth. The Israelites came from Shem, from which the word Semitic derives. Eber was the great-grandson of Shem, and Eber is the name from which the word Hebrew derives. God prophesied in the scriptures that after he scattered the tribes of Israel, he would regather them in the end times. We know that Israel became a nation in 1948 and that there have been Jews returning there since. We also know that we are in end times. Paul referred to his own times almost 2,000 years ago, as these last days, in Hebrews 1:2, so we are now at the end of the latter days. After the captivity, the 10 lost tribes of Israel were absorbed into many countries worldwide, with many losing touch with their roots and their descendants not even knowing they are Israelites. Here are some of the scriptures about the dispersion and the regathering. I will also leave a scripture list of the others I collected, in the description box below the video. Jeremiah 15:4, quote, "And I will cause them to be removed into all kingdoms of the earth, because of Manasseh the son of Hezekiah king of Judah, for that which he did in Jerusalem." End quote. Hosea 7:8, quote, "Ephraim, he hath mixed himself among the people, Ephraim is a cake not turned." End quote. Zechariah 11:14, quote, "Then I cut asunder mine other staff, even bands, that I might break the brotherhood between Judah and Israel." End quote. Jeremiah 31:8, quote, "Behold, I will bring them from the north country, and gather them from the coasts of the earth, and with them the blind and the lame, the woman with child and her that travaileth with child together, a great company shall return thither." End quote. Jeremiah 33:7, quote, "And I will cause the captivity of Judah and the captivity of Israel to return, and will build them, as at the first." End quote. Isaiah 10:21-22, quote, "The remnant shall return, even the remnant of Jacob, unto the mighty God. For though thy people Israel be as the sand of the sea, yet a remnant of them shall return, the consumption decreed shall overflow with righteousness." End quote. Isaiah 11:11-12, quote, "And it shall come to pass in that day, that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left, from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. And he shall set up an ensign for the nations, and shall assemble the outcasts of Israel, and gather together the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth." End quote. Isaiah 11:16, quote, "And there shall be an highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left, from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt." End quote. In the New Testament, the fact that the tribes were dispersed, to include the 10 tribes that were lost, was acknowledged. John 11:51-52, quote, "And this spake he not of himself, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus should die for that nation, and not for that nation only, but that also he should gather together in one the children of God that were scattered abroad." End quote. James 1:1, quote, "James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting." End quote. I obtained the information now following, from 2 excellent works which I will link to in the description box below the video, from Israelite Info website and the United States and Britain in Bible Prophecy booklet, by the United Church of God, quoted text from the latter, highlighted green. We know that the tribe of Judah started returning to Israel in the 20th century after it became a nation in 1948. In view of what the scriptures say, it's impossible that the Jews who have thus far returned to Israel, include the 10 northern tribes. And when you consider that the 10 lost tribes consist of millions of Europeans, Americans, Australians, New Zealanders, and others, it goes without saying that these numbers could not all be in geographical Israel. The regathering is clearly end times future prophecy. In the 8th century BC, as recorded in the Dictionary of Christ and the Gospels, Volume 1, page 692, we find out that Phoenicians and Israelites were carried away by Babylonians and Assyrians, but there was also a voluntary dispersion. This occurred due to the fearsome reputation of the barbaric Assyrians who the Hebrews knew were closing in. Many supposedly Phoenician-speaking European colonists were in fact Hebrews. Ireland was known as Iberian, and the ancient name of the Hebrews was Iberi, the modern Hebrew, from the name Eber or Heber. In Wales, the same people were known as Iodirium, and the Celtic Cymri, also known as Cambria or Cumbria, pronounced Cymri, which was the name of the Israelites in ancient texts. See The March of Archaeology by C.W. Sarum, page 216. How many of the people of Europe and further afield are of Hebrew descent? Irish history records three main waves of colonization. One is the Tuatha De Danann, which means tribe of Dan. Another is the Milesians. Both were from Asia, and the banner of the Milesians was a flag showing a dead serpent and the rod of Moses. They were from Gedalius, whose grandfather was king of Scythia. The Greek word for Scythia is from the Semitic skutha, and Persian saka, which are terms for Israelites. The serpent symbol was the emblem of the tribe of Dan. Historians record Phoenicians going into the Atlantic as far as the British Isles. Israel had strong commercial ties with them. See Judges 5:17 and 1 Kings 9:26. Ancient traditions showed that some Israeli traders settled in the British Isles. Israel may not acknowledge the multitudes of brethren they have, scattered worldwide, but God knows who they are and will regather them. Many white Europeans, and by a process of emigration, Americans, Australians, and New Zealanders, have no idea who they are. There could also be other Israelites in Asia and Africa, but don't be misled by the Black Hebrew movement. There will be many surprised people at the time of the regathering of Israel. Here follows extracts from the United States and Britain in Bible Prophecy booklet, telling the story of how the lost tribes ended up where they now are. Quote, almost 800 years after Israel disappeared as a nation, the Apostle Paul described Gentiles, non-Israelites, who are without Christ, as aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. See Ephesians 2:12. With God promising that he would not hide his intentions from Abraham, see Genesis 18:17 and Amos 3:7, the angels then visiting the aged patriarch affirmed the promises that Abraham would surely become a great and mighty nation, a physical, material, and national commitment of immense scope. They also reconfirmed the messianic promise that all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him, see Genesis 18:18. Genesis 22 concludes with God restating the central elements of his commitment to Abraham, indeed I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. Verse 17, New American Standard Bible. These physical, material, and national blessings continue as clues to the identity of Abraham's modern descendants. Through Jacob, God passed the national and material aspects of his promises on to the descendants of Abraham's great-great-grandsons, Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, see Genesis 48, 1-22. At one level this promise would be fulfilled by the time the several million Israelites reached Mount Sinai under Moses' leadership and, later, at the time of Solomon, see Deuteronomy 1:10 and 1 Kings 4, 20-21. But Moses himself was aware that the blessings of great multitudes were to be multiplied many times over what had already occurred by his time, see Deuteronomy 1:11. The physical blessings passed down to Isaac normally would have gone to the firstborn son, Esau, see Genesis 25, 21-26. However, Jacob, the younger of twin brothers, persuaded Esau to sell his birthright to him for a meal of stew, see verse 29-34. In Genesis 35 we encounter another aspect of the birthright promise. Here God promised Jacob that a nation and a company of nations would proceed from him, see verse 11. Knowledge of this aspect of Israel's inheritance is essential if we are to understand key prophecies. The birthright promise would be fulfilled in two separate national entities. Jacob's blessing included land, national territory, that his two grandsons' descendants would inherit for an everlasting possession. They also would grow into a multitude of people, see verse 4. Here, for a second time, we see the remarkable promise that Jacob's descendants, specifically those who would spring from Ephraim and Manasseh, would grow into a multitude of nations and a single great nation, respectively, see verse 19. Perhaps the most revealing of the biblical passages about the birthright promise, however, is in Genesis 49. Here we find Jacob blessing and prophesying about each of his sons' descendants in the last days, see verse 1. Notice that the blessings Jacob pronounces on the descendants of Joseph for the last days are monumental. This prophetic passage tells us that Joseph's descendants in the last days will live in a productive, well-watered, and fruitful land. They will be a people who have greatly expanded their territory and influence, politically, militarily, economically, and culturally, a people whose branches grow over the wall, or beyond their natural borders. End quote. Israel became a kingdom under Saul, succeeded by David. At the time of David and his son Solomon, Israel became a trading nation and employed Phoenician and Israelite sailors. Quote, the Bible reveals that the history of Israel and Phoenicia was far more intertwined than most historians have recognized. In general, they prospered together in good times and suffered together during the bad. They had common enemies. They rose to international power together and were later conquered by the Assyrian Empire at about the same time. The people in the coastal area around Tyre and nearby Sidon shared an alphabet and more or less the same Semitic language with Israel. Other than slight cultural and dialectical differences, the languages appear to have been almost identical. The Phoenician port cities also gave Israel direct access to vast international markets through their maritime control of the Mediterranean Sea. Historians have records of the Phoenicians venturing into the Atlantic Ocean at least as far as the British Isles, and some believe they traveled far beyond. This, then, means Israel had the same access to these areas. Israel, under David and Solomon, was a full partner in Phoenicia's international greatness and fame. The international commercial and political influence of Solomon was far greater than most recent historians have perceived. During this time, it is likely that some of Israel's traders settled in the British Isles, establishing small colonies. Although historical information about this period is sparse, many ancient traditions indicate this is what happened. End quote. God became angry with King Solomon for marrying foreign women and worshipping false gods, and he brought judgment by dividing the kingdom, see 1 Kings 11:11-12. The northern 10 tribes split from the 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin in around 931 BC. Quote, at this point, more than 200 years before the Assyrians conquered the northern 10 tribes, they became separate as the kingdom, or house, of Israel. The southern tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and a part of Levi would then be known as the kingdom, or house, of Judah. The scepter promise of a divine king remained with the tribe of Judah. The northern tribes kept the name of Jacob, or Israel. With them went the birthright promise of national greatness, prosperity, and wealth. To them went, by right of birth, the physical blessings and national standing God had promised to Joseph. End quote. After King Jeroboam established a competing religious system, erecting false idols, dismissing the Levitical priests, the northern kingdom appeared to the outside world as an extension of the Phoenician Empire. Quote, the distinction that God had originally intended between Israel and the surrounding nations was soon obliterated. So it is no wonder that historians have difficulty detecting Israel's role in the region as anything other than traders with the coastal Phoenician cities. End quote. The northern kingdom was the first to go into captivity. Quote, the first deportation of Israelites, circa 733 to 732 BC, sometimes referred to as the Galilean captivity, took part of the population, principally drawn from the tribes of Naphtali, Reuben, Gad, and the portion of Manasseh living east of the Jordan River, to northern Syria and northern and northwestern Mesopotamia, see 2 Kings 15, 27-29, and 1 Chronicles 5:26. Tiglath-Pileser III also occupied the greater part of Galilee and Gilead and divided Israelite territory itself into 4 new provinces, Megiddo, Duru, Gilead, and Samaria. A pro-Assyrian but unreliable Israelite vassal, King Hashia, circa 732-722 BC, set in motion the events that brought the northern kingdom's dissolution. Hoping to receive critical aid from Egypt, to the south, Hashia betrayed Assyrian trust around 724 BC. See 2 Kings 18, 9-10. Shalmaneser V responded with a siege, circa 724-722 BC, that resulted in the fall of Israel's capital city, Samaria. At that point the northern kingdom ceased to exist as a political entity. With the extinction of the northern kingdom as a political entity, its people were divided and scattered beyond the Euphrates River in Assyria's eastern territories. God would now fulfill his promise to sift the house of Israel among all nations, see Amos 9:9. At this time they disappeared from history as the people of Israel. The Israelites had already begun to serve other gods, having abandoned the religious practices that obviously distinguished them from other peoples. Among other things, they had abandoned the seventh-day Sabbath. Once their conquerors removed them from their homeland, they were merely refugees, part of the great mass of dislocated peoples the Assyrians had exiled. No longer did they possess outward characteristics that easily distinguished them from the peoples around them. Their obvious identifying signs quickly disappeared. But among their tribes fragments of their identity and culture would not so easily disappear. How then, can we find them? We need to look at the general region to which they were exiled and see if a people suddenly appeared in the region with characteristics that link them to the refugees of Israel's northern kingdom. What we find is an amazing story, over many centuries, of God guiding displaced Israelites to the very region far to the north and west of their homeland that his prophets had foretold. Historians accept that most of the ancestors of today's Western democracies once lived as nomadic tribes roaming the vast grassland plains of antiquity known as the Eurasian steppes. One particular group of these migratory peoples, identified as Scythians by the Greeks, suddenly appeared on the Eurasian steppes about the same time the 10 tribes of Israel disappeared from history. Is there a connection? The Encyclopedia Britannica says, Assyrian documents place their appearance there between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea in the time of King Sargon, 722-705 BC, a date which closely corresponds with that of the establishment of the first group of Scythians in southern Russia, see Rice, pages 19-20 and 44. This date also corresponds with the disappearance of the captives from Israel's northern kingdom. During the late 8th century BC, records from the Caucasian kingdom of Urartu, which controlled the northern reaches of the Euphrates River, also noted the appearance of a group called Cimmerians. The book, From the Lands of the Scythians, explains, 2 groups, Cimmerians and Scythians, seem to be referred to in Urartian and Assyrian texts, but it is not always clear whether the terms indicate 2 distinct peoples or simply mounted nomads. Historian Samuel Lysons spoke of the Cimmerians seeming to be the same people as the Gauls or Celts under a different name. John Henry and James Parker, our British ancestors, who and what were they? 1865, pages 23 and 27. Anne Christensen, a respected Danish linguistic scholar, recently reached the conclusion that the Cimmerians, who later became known as the Celts, can positively be identified as the deported Israelites. In the beginning of her research, Dr. Christensen was skeptical and subscribed to the traditional theory that the Cimmerians were Aryan tribes the Scythians had chased out of the north, as Herodotus had theorized. But as she dug more and more into the Assyrian sources, she found the Cimmerians first appeared in history in 714 BC in the region of Iran, south of Armenia, where the kings of Assyria had settled many of the deported Israelites. She came to the conclusion that the Gimera, or Cimmerians, represented at least a part of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Dr. Christensen writes, "There is scarcely reason, any longer, to doubt the exciting and verily astonishing assertion propounded by the students of the 10 tribes that the Israelites deported from Bit Humria, of the house of Omri, are identical with the 𝗬𝗎 of the Assyrian sources. Everything indicates that Israelite deportees did not vanish from the picture, but that, abroad, under new conditions, they continued to leave their mark on history. Who were the Sumerians, and where did they come from? Sargon II, the Sumerians, and Rusa I, translated from the Danish by Jørgen Læsø, the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters, number 57, 1988, pages 126 to 127. Scholars find a logical explanation for how the word Celt, in reference to the western branch of the steppe people, originated. Some conclude that the ethnic label Celt is another form of the Goidelic Irish word sealt, which means concealment or hidden. The Scottish word kilt is of a similar derivation. This fits the Celts' strongly held religious prohibition against setting in writing their folk traditions, knowledge, and understanding. The traditions were to be communicated only orally, and we can be sure the purpose of the prohibition was not to cover illiteracy. Many Celts spoke and wrote Greek and used it in private and public business. But they staunchly refused to divulge to outsiders any information about their most revered beliefs and traditions. Even Julius Caesar, during his invasion of Gaul, could only marvel at this strong Celtic religious prohibition. Some scholars conclude the word Cultoi, or Celt, is an appropriate label for people who kept much about their past and traditions hidden. In spite of the Celts' characteristic secrecy, enough history was recorded for us to come to the conclusion that the Celts and Scythians came from a common Israelite heritage. Their migrations had taken them in different directions. In the end, however, these descendants would find themselves together again in Europe. Today, historians use the term Scythian mostly in reference to the Saka, or Saki, Scyths. These people became the leading tribes of the Scythian culture. They inspired its dynamic way of life and its political, artistic, economic, and social leadership. From the 7th century BC forward, it was the Saka, or Saki tribes, that defined what it meant to be Scythian from the Black Sea all the way to the mountains of Mongolia. Before the early 20th century, European and American historians assumed the Scythians were of the Mongol people from Asia. Modern anthropological research, however, has shown this idea to be false. Most scholars are convinced that no ethnic links exist between the Saka Scythians and the Mongols or the Slavic peoples. However, this doesn't mean the scattered former tribes on the Eurasian steppes, the peoples the Greeks first labeled Scythians before the 8th century BC, all suddenly disappeared. Rather, the Saka Scyths simply began to dominate the steppe region from 700 to 500 BC. During that time the Saka Scyths, accompanied by a smaller mixture of other tribes of Middle Eastern origin such as displaced Medes, Elamites and Assyrians, became the predominant peoples on the Eurasian plains. In fact, until sometime in the 5th or 4th century BC the predominant inhabitants of even western Siberia were a fair-haired people of European origin, and it was after that date that an influx of Mongoloids resulted in a very mixed type of population. Rice, page 77. Close examination of 20th century archaeological discoveries plainly and consistently portray the Saka Scythians as physically like the present-day people of Europe. The scriptures plainly tell us that the Israelites, after the Assyrians forcibly deported them from their homeland, relocated in Hala, on the Habur, the river of Gozan in northern Assyria, and in the cities of the Medes, see 2 Kings 18:11. This is not far from the region of Urartu, between the Black and Caspian Seas, where the Scythians had established a temporary kingdom. Obviously no one could any longer identify them as citizens of their former Middle Eastern kingdom. So they acquired a new identity. Only their old sub-tribal, or clan names remained mostly the same. Those names have proven to be important in preserving their identity as the lost 10 tribes of Israel. In the Bible the people of Israel are sometimes called the sons of Isaac. God promised that the name of Isaac would continue to identify Israel as a people, see Genesis 21:12. In biblical times the Hebrew language was written with no vowels. Thus Isaac would have been spelled simply SK or SC in the English equivalents of the Hebrew characters. We should not consider it astonishing that shortly after the exile of the 10 tribes the term 𝗧𝗍𝗍, the letters for the name Isaac with the Latin plural ending ae, identified the new settlers in the Black Sea region of Scythia. British historian Sharon Turner tells us, the Saxons who migrated to the British Isles were a Scythian tribe, and of the various Scythian nations, the 𝗧𝗍𝗍, or 𝗧𝗍𝗍, are the people from whom the descent of the Saxons may be inferred, with the least violation of probability. 𝗧𝗍𝗍 or the sons of the 𝗧𝗍𝗍, abbreviated into Saxoon, which is the same sound as Saxon, seems a reasonable etymology of the word Saxon. The History of the Anglo-Saxons, Volume 1, 1840, page 59. The Behistun Rock, a mural carved in stone near present-day Behistun, Iran, provides linguistic clues to the understanding of several ancient languages. The rock relief dates from the reign of Darius I of Persia, circa 522 to 486 BC. Its depiction of conquered foreign kings paying homage was inscribed in the Old Persian, Elamite, Susian, and Babylonian languages. One sees 𝗬𝗀𝗍𝗀, king of the temporarily subjugated Asiatic branch of Scythians, pictured as the last one in line. The Behistun rock describes him as the king of the Scythians, Saka, or Cimmerians, pronounced Gimiri in Babylonian, showing that the Scythians and Cimmerians were essentially the same people. Considerable evidence connects the Celts of Europe with the Cimmerians who fled from the Near East to Asia Minor at the time the armies of Babylon were conquering the Assyrian Empire. From Asia Minor the Cimmerians migrated by way of the Danube River into Europe, where they became known as the Celts. Many historians have concluded that the Celts and Scythians have a common background. What is the origin of the name Cimmerian? The Assyrian conquerors of the northern 10 tribes called them Bit Cymru, or Gomri, meaning the house of Omri. Omri was one of the most militarily successful kings of the Kingdom of Israel. He founded his own dynasty of kings. Inscriptions of the time refer to the Israelite kingdom as the land or house of Omri. In Greek we find the forms Kimeri, Kimmeroi, and Kimri, and, in Latin, Cimbri, Cimbrians and Cimbres as the equivalents of the Assyrian Cymri. The distinction between Scythian and Celtic cultures is probably best explained by 2 factors. First, the geography supporting each culture was generally different. But, equally important, 10 Israelite tribes were exiled from the Middle East. Each of these had its own culture within the larger culture of Israel's northern kingdom. Also, each tribe was further subdivided into clans. See 1 Samuel 10:19, compare Exodus 6:14-25, NIV. Therefore, one would expect these exiled Israelite tribes to continue exhibiting some cultural differences in the lands of their exile. Such distinctions would also explain the clans and subclans existing among the Scythians and Celts. After about 5 centuries of existence on the Eurasian steppes following the destruction of the northern kingdom, Israel's nomadic descendants, now called Scythians, began another forced migration. This time their enemies, from Asia and the Near East, and a dramatic change of climate on the Eurasian steppes began moving them westward, just as the biblical prophets had said would happen. See 1 Kings 14:15, Isaiah 49:12 and Hosea 12:1. This major westward migration began about 200 BC and continued into the 5th century AD. Although many clans from many tribes converged on Europe at the same time, most of those that finally settled in northwest Europe were related and shared a culture. Many historians have acknowledged that the Anglo-Saxon peoples provided the racial stock that founded several modern Western nations, including Great Britain and the United States. This information can be found in many history books. What isn't widely understood is the Celtic-Scythian link to the ancient Israelites. When we understand that the modern descendants of Joseph are the people of the United States and Britain, we see that over the past 3 centuries God has been true to his promises. He has granted the physical birthright blessings of Joseph's sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, to their modern descendants, the Anglo-Saxon Celtic people of Britain and the United States. The Anglo-Saxon and Celtic descendants have been the primary founders and shapers of British and American culture. God also has made available to them opportunities to shine as spiritual beacons within a confused and darkened world. Britain's status in the world is only a shadow of what it was a century ago. You might have had difficulty convincing many people who lived in the 19th and 20th centuries that God was not somehow miraculously prospering the politicians, statesmen, diplomats, explorers, generals, admirals, soldiers, architects, engineers, scientists, inventors, bankers, businessmen, shopkeepers, and entrepreneurs of the British Isles. To many observers, both in and out of Britain, it appeared that success came to the British people whether they even pursued it, whether they made wise or foolish choices. It was as though certain blessings were overtaking them. It was the perceived inevitability of success that inspired John Robert Seeley, Cambridge Professor of Modern History, 1834 to 1895, and author of The Expansion of England, 1884, to make the famous quip that England acquired her globe-spanning empire in a fit of absence of mind. The 1800s were certainly Britain's century. To their own astonishment, the people of the relatively tiny British Isles found themselves ruling over a mighty empire. As the 19th century drew to a close, the British Empire was the largest empire in the history of the world, comprising nearly a quarter of the land mass of the earth, and a quarter of its population. James Morris, Pax Britannica, The Climax of an Empire, 1968, page 21. Yet the empire would continue to expand. It continued to grow until 1933, when its area was 13.9 million square miles and its population 493 million. The Roman Empire in its prime comprised perhaps 120 million people in an area of 2.5 million square miles. Ibid. Pages 27 and 42. The British Empire, then, spanned 5.5 times the territory of the Roman Empire, with more than 4 times the subjects. British rule extended over not just ordinary regions but some of the choicest and most fertile territories on earth. It is hardly surprising that educated people of the day perceived the hand of God in the process. To them it seemed too obvious to ignore. For example, Lord Rosebery, a British Foreign Secretary, 1886 and 1892 to 1894, and Prime Minister, 1894 to 1895, spoke in November 1900 to the students of Glasgow University about the British Empire. How marvellous it all is! Built not by saints and angels, but by the work of men's hands, and yet not wholly human, for the most heedless and the most cynical must see the finger of the divine. Growing as trees grow, while others slept, fed by the faults of others as well as the character of our fathers, reaching with a ripple of a restless tide over tracts and islands and continents, until our little Britain woke up to find herself the foster mother of nations and the source of united empires. Do we not hail in this less the energy and fortune of a race than the supreme direction of the Almighty? The wars between France and England that culminated with the British victory over Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, had an indirect influence on America's rise to greatness. Napoleon's need for ready cash to pay for the costs of impending war with England led him to sell France's vast American territories to the United States as the Louisiana Purchase. The acquisition of the Louisiana Territory in 1803 gave the American Republic instant world power status. The young country bought 828,000 square miles of the most fertile farmland in the world, the American Midwest, for less than 3 cents per acre. Overnight the size of the United States doubled, immeasurably strengthening the nation materially and strategically. After that 1803 transaction, the country expanded across the continent in less than a generation, adding huge swathes of territory with vast natural resources. In 1867 the United States added almost 600,000 more square miles when it purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million, about 2 cents per acre. End quote. These extracts summarize how the 10 lost tribes of Israelites were mingled and lost in the world and fulfilled the prophecies made in the Old Testament to Ephraim and Manasseh. Here is also abbreviated information from an excellent video called The Lost Tribes of Israel, which I will leave a link to in the description box below the video. After the displacement, the lost tribes became known by other names: Cimmerians, Scythians, Goths, Celts, Anglo-Saxon. Welsh people descended from the Cimmerians, another name for Gauls and Celts. In historian Reverend Samuel Lyson's 1865 book Our British Ancestors, he said that the Welsh are a Celtic people who still call themselves Cymry. Historians claim that the Scythians were ancestors of Anglo-Saxons that invaded Britain after the Roman withdrawal. Historian Sharon Turner in his History of the Anglo-Saxons says the Anglo-Saxons, Lowland Scots, Normans, Danes, Norwegians, Swedes, Germans, Dutch, Belgians, Lombards and Franks all come from Scythian, German, Gothic. The Roman historian Tacitus and the geographer Ptolemy name the river Elbe in the lower half of the German peninsula, as the places inhabited by Angles and Saxons before they came to Britain. British historian Ninnius's account of arrival of Hengist and Horsa in England, states that messengers were sent to Scythia for reinforcements. We can therefore trace Anglo-Saxon ancestors back to North Europe, South Russia, and Media, where the Israelites were placed in captivity. One of the first places they landed in England was the East Coast, which is now known as Suffolk. At the archaeological site at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, is evidence of the arrival of the lost tribes on British shores. Burial mounds at Sutton Hoo had inside a 90 feet long Anglo-Saxon burial ship, indicating the burial of a rich nobleman or king, in which was treasure including silver bowls with the Star of David engraved in them. Native British were made up of Scythian Anglo-Saxons, Cimmerian Celts, Vikings, and Normans. Anthropologists such as E.A. Freeman of Trinity College, Oxford, in his Origin of the English Nation describes native Britons as a union of various tribes of the same stock, which passed over from the old Teutonic mainland to grow up as a new people. Migrations occurred across Asia Minor and then Europe from the captivity in Assyria. As predicted by the biblical prophets, this brought them to the new promised lands in Europe. The promises made to their patriarch Jacob are also fulfilled, with further migrations west into America, east into Australasia, north into Canada and south into Africa. These countries, with their common law based upon the biblical commandments, have inherited in their heraldries symbols which were once the property of ancient Israel. There is more. Scriptures, as always, help with the evidence, and this time it's physical. The first man was made out of the dust of the earth, another word for which is clay. If you search on the internet, it says that most pure clay is white. In Genesis 2:5, the word used for man is Strong's H120. 𝗟𝗂𝗻. Quote, from H119, ruddy, that is, a human being, an individual or the species, mankind, etc. End quote. Someone of a ruddy complexion is white, with a blush to their cheeks, rosy-cheeked. We also learn from scriptures that Esau, the son of Abraham, was red, see Genesis 25:25, meaning red-haired. Many people believe that all ancient Israelites were swarthy, olive-skinned, dark-haired, and dark-eyed people. But the evidence shows that they were a typical Caucasian mixture of some pale-skinned, light-haired and eyed people, red and blonde, and some olive-skinned and dark-haired, with ranges in between and combinations thereof, and this is much like present-day Jews and like so many Caucasian Europeans. They were, and are, Caucasian. There is a movement called the Black Hebrew Israelites, which is a cult, and is simply a false premise, saying that the original Hebrews were black. As we have seen from Genesis 10:21, the Semitic people came from Noah's son Shem, all the dark-skinned peoples came from Noah's son Ham, as Genesis 10:6-7 evidences. It doesn't actually take very long for a people group to develop specific facial characteristics and skin color if they are isolated in a particular area. See the article entitled How Did All the Different Races Arise? From Noah's Family, about this, in the description box below the video. When it comes to Jesus, if we look at the Shroud of Turin, his features are not the features of a black man, they are Caucasian. Many wrongly believe the shroud was proven a fake, because of a cover-up, involving testing a repaired corner, woven with medieval fibers following fire damage at that time. Please visit www.shroud.com to see the amazing evidence that the shroud is genuine. Jesus came from the line of David, and David, as we will see from the following scriptures, just like the word for man, meaning Adam, is described in scriptures as ruddy, Someone with dark or even olive skin cannot be described as ruddy. We can't say from this whether Jesus was white or olive-skinned because we don't know what coloring Mary was, but he was Caucasian. 1 Samuel 16:12, quote, "And he sent, and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, and withal of a beautiful countenance, and goodly to look to. And the Lord said, Arise, anoint him, for this is he." End quote. 1 Samuel 17:42, quote, "And when the Philistine looked about, and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance." End quote. In Genesis Rabbah 86:3 Joseph is described as white, and in Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sota Folio 36a, links in the description box, Joseph's face is described as a rose, clearly meaning he was pink-skinned. King Solomon, David's son, was also described the same way. Song of Solomon 5:10, quote, "My beloved is white and ruddy, the chiefest among 10,000. End quote. There follows a photograph of the mummy of what has been identified as Joseph, who is clearly blonde and Caucasian featured, and an ancient painting relating to the Exodus, depicting a blue-eyed white Israelite, with dark hair, and below that, is another one with a mixture of pink-skinned blonde and dark-haired olive-skinned Israelite slaves in Egypt. Left, Uriah, Joseph II, Biblical Joseph, Egyptian Prime Minister during 1400 BC. Uriah's blonde hair and Caucasian facial structure have been well preserved by the embalming process. Source: Burlington News website. The original source of this wall painting, right, is unknown. It was found on a website called _org. It depicts a blue-eyed Hebrew slave in Egypt before the Exodus. Aside from the above, there are also other Egyptian tomb wall paintings depicting light-skinned and blonde or red-headed Hebrews among the olive-skinned darker-haired ones. Israelites were therefore Caucasian and had a variety of hair and eye colors and skin tones ranging from fair to olive-skinned, just as the present-day Jews do. When the lost tribes spread into other parts of the world, they mixed with, or became, the European races, which then spread to USA, Australia, New Zealand, and other areas. There could well be Israelites, or people of Israelite descent, in any ethnically dark-skinned country of course, but the bulk of them have to be Caucasian from the evidence. That doesn't mean that every European is of Israelite descent, of course. We cannot tell by looking at someone whether they are of Israelite descent. People are very mixed and some could be part Israelite and part other races. And this only contributes to how the 10 tribes became lost. God of course knows exactly where they are and from which tribe they originate. Isaiah 10:22 says that Israelites would be as the sand of the sea, and we know that the Jewish people aren't such a large group to be described that way. In 2019 the global population of Jews was estimated at 14,707,400, which is 0.2% of the world's population, roughly equal to the population of Zimbabwe, and includes those who are only part Jewish. That doesn't sound like the sand of the sea, and it isn't, because 10 of the tribes are lost. I will leave a lengthy list of really interesting links in the description box below the video, which will give a lot more information on this topic, including DNA, languages, Israelite royalty, and migration routes. I particularly recommend the video called The Lost Tribes of Israel, which goes in detail into the route they took to Europe, naming places along the way. I hope this information helps explain the mystery of the lost tribes and what is to come. God bless you all, Amen.